Hi, this is Rabbi Daniel Karapkin for webyeshiva.org. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim. Sorry, just a couple of minutes late in starting today. It's a statutory holiday here in Canada, so the davening times were a little bit later for us. But let's get started. We are in Moreh Nevukhim, chapter 73 of the first section. We are in the middle of chapter 73, and we were discussing the the 12 premises of the Mutakalimun, that the Rambam has been teaching us up until now that there is another school of philosophy other than himself that is also based on religious beliefs. However, the Rambam is an Aristotelian and he subscribes to a system of belief that believes in a holistic universe that is constantly under the supervision of the Ribono Shel Olam, of the Almighty, of the Master of the universe, and that the entire universe is one um, holistic, unitary whole that emanates from the one unitary God. And there is another school of philosophy known as the Mutakalimun, or the Kalamists. And they have a dramatically different view of the universe and how it is made up and how it is constantly in the state of creation. There is no past or future for the Kalamists. There's only now, because everything is constantly now. Everything is constantly being recreated. And we talked about last week how the words that we say in our prayers, Hamechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reshit, that God constantly renews creation on a constant basis, is certainly taken quite literally by the Kalamists, in that they subscribe to this idea that the world is comprised of atoms, and that everything can be broken down into its smallest particles, and that there are spaces between these particles. And as well, that time is also particulated and that it is atomized in the very same way, so that everything is constantly segmented into the tiniest moments of time, and everything is constantly being recreated. That's what we're up to, and we saw the first 6 of the 12 sort of postulates or premises of the Mutakalimun. And let me share my screen with you so that we can continue in this idea. Okay. All right. So we were discussing the first 6, and that atoms, number 1 was atoms exist and make up everything. Vacuums exist and are the stuff between atoms. Time is atomic. Every moment is now. Every substance must possess atoms. Let me just make sure that I am audible. I hope that everyone can hear me. Here, let me just make sure that I can, I'm going to share my screen again, sorry. All right, here we go. Atoms exist and make up everything. Number 2, vacuums exist and are the stuff between atoms. Number 3, time is atomic. Every moment is now. Number 4, every substance must possess accidents, and that's what we pointed out, that every single atom is the same. There's no one kind of atom versus another kind of atom. Every atom is just a plain atom. They're all the same, and that accidents, or what we call attributes of, let's say, whiteness, softness, darkness, any kind of essential makeup of that atom is added onto it, known as an accident. And these accidents reside in the atoms, is number 5. And number 6, each accident exists only for an instant, so that when I see, for example, a person wearing a red sweater, that red sweater is constantly being recreated, and its attributes of redness and of sweaterness and of fabric are constantly being recreated. And that's the way that the Mutakalimun view the universe. And we haven't really discussed so much the reason ultimately why, what is leading the Mutakalimun to this kind of conclusion. So we're going to see 7, 8, and 9. And then when we get to number 10, we will discuss the why. Like, what is the ultimate objective of this kind of philosophy of existence? So let's go to number 7. And number 7 states as follows. Again, I have to apologize. I'm just not sure if I am if I am if I am being live here or not. Can everybody? I hope everybody can hear me. I should be audible to everybody. Okay, so all right, I'm going to share my screen one more time, and I'll have bitachon that everybody can hear me. Okay, all right, very good. So number 7, we're going to look at it outside using this outline. Um, the Rambam's statement. Well, we'll start it off just the first few points on page 203 in the Pines edition. It consists in their belief that privations of habitus are things that exist in a body, being superadded to its substance and are also accordingly also existent accidents. What that means in a bit of a simpler English is that you and I, in thinking philosophically about what attributes exist in matter, we would say either something has something or it doesn't have something. So either, well, we'll give you an example. Something is in motion, and if it's not in motion, it is at rest. But its being at rest is not an imbued attribute. It simply is the lack of motion. Okay? And similarly, if we say that something is alive, it means it is imbued with the attribute of life. But if it's dead, it's not that it's imbued with the attribute of death, but rather it is withdrawn, life has been withdrawn from that substance or from that individual. Okay, so the Mutakalimun have a different view, and they basically say that everything is an imbued attribute, is something, every substance, every atom is given an attribute of its existence, whether that attribute is a positive attribute or it's something that we would normally consider to be the privation or the removal of something positive. They view that even negative attributes are imbued by God, by our Creator, into those atoms that make up those things which we would normally say are lacking something. That's not true. They're not lacking anything. They're imbued with the attribute of something that is negative. So, for example, the state of rest is not a privation of motion. The state of death is not a privation of life. The state of blindness is not a privation of sight. And the state of ignorance is not a privation of knowledge. But rather, rest is an attribute that is constantly being created and recreated within a substance. If I see a paperweight on a table and it's completely at rest, it's because God imbues that paperweight with the attribute of restness, of being at rest. If I see an animal or a human being that is presently deceased, dead, it is not that they have just been had life withdrawn from them, but God is constantly recreating that corpse with the attribute of being dead, the state of deadness. Um, if a person is blind, it means that they are constantly being recreated with the privation of eyesight, that God is actively imbuing them with blindness. And similarly, if a person lacks knowledge, if a person is ignorant, it's because of this idea of the mutakalimun that everything is constantly being recreated on a constant basis, then our thoughts are constantly being re-imbued within us. And therefore, if a person lacks knowledge, then that lack of knowledge is constantly being re-imbued within that person. And of course, the Rambam says that this is hard to get our heads around. It doesn't really make very much sense to him. And the challenge that he says is how long does the accident of death exist in a decaying body? In other words, if a person is a corpse and that corpse is in the process of decomposition, at what point does God cease to consider that a corpse for which he has to constantly re-imbue the state of deathness within that corpse? At what level of decomposition is it no longer considered a corpse? Is that when there's uh, uh, no longer a semblance of it being a corpse where it's mostly decomposed? Or does even one atom of that corpse that remains require God to constantly recreate that corpse flesh with the state of deadness within it? And what about fossilized remains? We know that the Rambam says we've unearthed fossils of dead animals and dead people that have been turned into stone. Are they constantly still being recreated with the state of deadness within them? So the Rambam says that it doesn't really, I mean, the Rambam is trying to reduce these premises of the Mutakalimun into their most absurd conclusion, and he does a pretty good job. And if you note at the very bottom of page 204, he says there's a certain level of inconsistency within the Mutakalimun. There are certain attributes that are not being constantly recreated because they do ultimately have to acknowledge that certain things that exist with a lack of an attribute really do have a privation and are not constantly being re-imbued with something positive. But he says they're totally inconsistent about this issue. And the reason for that inconsistency is, as he says, for according to them, some of the accidents last for some time, whereas others do not last for 2 units of time. They're contradictory sometimes, for the purpose of all of them is to suppose an existent universe, the nature of which fits in with our opinions and teachings. In other words, he's going back to his quote that he made from Themistius, the Greek philosopher, back in chapter 71, that unfortunately, whereas a true philosopher uh, comes up with true conclusions about reality, and then if he finds any inconsistencies with his faith, he readjusts his faith. For a person who is an inferior kind of philosopher, he works with certain faith principles, and if he discovers that science indicates to the opposite, he has to retool or rejig the science. And he feels that that is the way that the Kalamists are operating, that they are basing their analysis of science, scientific reality, and of physics based upon their religious conclusions, and that's not the way a philosopher ought to behave. We get into the eighth premise, and we'll just read the outline over here. The atoms throughout the universe are the same. All differences in substances are not innate, but rather due to different accidents. And this is really just a continuation of what he had said previously in number 4, in premise number 4, that there is no such thing as innate properties. In other words, for the Aristotelian, there are certain kinds of matter and certain kinds of form that are innate to the substance in question. So, as we discussed in the very first chapter of Moreh Nevukhim, a human being who's created B'Tselem Elokim in the image of God is innately human, has the form of humanity imbued within that organism. And it's not considered to be something that is incidental or accidental to the human being, but rather their intellect, that which makes them uniquely human, is innate to the human being. But there are certain things that are accidental to that human being, or incidental is what we would say. These are attributes that do not define the person's humanity, but that are imbued within that individual human being, such as the color of one's skin, one's gender, one's hair color, one's eye color, and so forth. But take those things away or change those things does not take away the humanity of that organism. And that's the difference between innate qualities and or intrinsic qualities versus extrinsic or accidental qualities. The Mutakalimun believe that because every atom is exactly the same, there is absolutely no difference between the substance that makes up the most primitive organism on this earth and the most lofty organism that exists in the cosmos. They are all comprised of the exact same atoms, And the only thing that is added on to each atom to make one thing a very primitive and tiny and puny organism, and another atom to be part of something very, very lofty and cosmological, are these what he calls the accidents. And he writes that in consequence, the body of heaven, even the body of the angels, or even the body of God's throne, as it is imagined in fantasy, and the body of any insect you like from among the insects of the earth, or of any plant you like, are, according to them, of one substance. Now, this is going to be objectionable to the Rambam, number one, because it both in chapter 9 and in chapter 49, the Rambam had said that there is no material essence that makes up either the throne of God or the angels. The Mutakalimun clearly disagree and say that just like everything on this earth is atomically constructed and physically based, so too the throne of God in their vision, in their imagination, and angels also are comprised of atoms, but added on to these atoms are certain extrinsic attributes that make these atoms present as more ethereal in their makeup and as removed from our plane of existence. But they're really made up of the same things. So the Rambam believes that this is almost like an absurd suggestion to suggest that there is nothing intrinsically different between an insect and the Kisei HaKavod and the throne of glory. First of all, he had established that the throne of glory has no material substance to make it up, nor do angels, but rather it is purely of an intellectual makeup, pure form without any matter at all. And therefore, the whole idea of them being comprised of atoms is impossible. But also that to suggest that there is no intrinsic difference between the lowliest and the loftiest of organisms is something that is offensive to the Rambam's sensibilities. And then we get into number 9, where the Rambam writes that no accident is dependent upon another, but each accident occurs independently. And by that, what the Rambam essentially means is that if you have steam coming out of a tea kettle, for example, and the steam is diffuse, it has a steamy makeup, and it's also hot to the touch. So according to the Mutakalimun, those two attributes of steam being in its state of cloudiness, of being diffuse and not being able to be touchable because it's steam, and the fact that it's hot are two attributes that are simultaneously imbued within the atoms of the steam. It's not that one is dependent upon the other. It's not that because the water is hot, it turns into steam, but rather its hotness and its steaminess are imbued within those atoms of the steam at the same time, and they are not dependent upon each other. But whatever God does to create steam that is hot, he creates the heat within the steam, and he creates the steaminess of the steam at the same time. There are two arguments that the Mutakalimun provide for that to prove this point. Number one, we had already established in premise number 6 that there is no such thing as causality in the belief of the Mutakalimun. It's not that A causes B, but rather that everything is created right now. So to suggest that there is one thing that causes another is contrary to the whole premise of the lack of causality. And number two, to suggest that heat is the reason for the steam, or that the heat produces the water to turn into steam, would require heat to be present in an atom chronologically before the water turns into steam, which would necessitate for heatness, which is an accidental attribute, to exist for longer of a period of time than just one instant in order for it to give rise to its product, which is the steaminess of the steam. Many other analogies like that, but the Rambam basically says that this is what drives the Mutakalimun to say that this cannot be, because every attribute of an atom can only exist for one instant, cannot exist for two instants. And therefore, for those two reasons, A, because there's no causality, and B, because of the chronological impossibility of an attribute existing for more than one instant, you can't have one accidental attribute being the cause of another accidental attribute. Everything occurs independently of each other, even though from a physics standpoint, clearly heat is what causes water to turn into steam, but that's not what the Mutakalimun believe. So that brings us up to number 10. And it's really sort of like the main event is this 10th attribute. And that's why I have it in bold text in our handout. Anything imaginable is possible. And as the Rambam spends a very large amount of space to try and unpack this 10th premise, because he points out this is the primary premise of the Mutakalimun, and why the other premises are put forth in order to lead to this conclusion. In other words, why are all of these other premises that the world is atomic, that time is atomic, and that every attribute that is imbued within an atom is not intrinsic but is rather extrinsic and accidental? Why are all of these premises necessary? Because for the Mutakalimun, anything that can be imagined is possible. In other words, they are maximalists in their belief in the idea of miracles occurring on a constant basis. They don't believe in this idea of nature, of any rules that compel God in any way to continue the universe as it currently is, but rather they suggest the world as it exists now is the convention for just this instant, and God can at any given moment change anything at any given time. And therefore, anything that a person can conjure with their imagination is something that could potentially exist anytime in the future. There is no rhyme or reason to the world as it exists now, and it sort of leads us to the belief that God is infinite in his capacity to do anything that he so desires. And it would seem that what drives the Mutakalimun to that belief is that if you believe in this idea of confined rules of nature, in some way that confines God's ability. And in order to increase or to expand God's omnipotence, to be able to do anything which he so desires, there are no rules. And God only allows this convention to exist for now, but that convention can change at any given moment. And therefore, if we look on page 206, the 10th premise consists in the affirmation of admissibility, which has different meanings, different translations, but basically it's the affirmation of possibility. This is the main proposition of the science of Kalam. Listen to its meaning. They are of the opinion that everything that may be imagined is a possible notion for the intellect. For instance, it is possible from the point of view of intellect that it should come about that the sphere of the earth should turn into a heaven endowed with a circular motion, and that the heaven should turn into the sphere of the earth. Is it imaginable? Is it possible that what we call now the heavens should turn into solid mass, and that the earth, which we call a solid mass, should turn into ethereal material? Of course, anything is possible. Or to take another example, it is possible that the sphere of fire should move toward the center of the earth, and that the sphere of the earth should move toward the encompassing heaven, meaning that the rules of physics, heat rises, fire rises, and anything that is made of earth falls to the ground through the laws of gravity. But that's just the convention for this one moment. That could change at any given moment in the future, so that heat will fall and earth will rise, because the rules of physics as they exist now are totally arbitrary, and God decided it for it to be now, but not necessarily for the future. And the Rambam makes a very interesting point further down on page 206. He says it's analogous to the fact that, for example, a person who is a dignitary, who's a sultan, normally when he goes out into public, he rides on a horse, would never be seen walking by foot out into the public square. But that's just a convention. That's just a social convention, a convention of his class within society. Should the Sultan choose to walk by foot through the marketplace, it's certainly possible. We don't expect him to do it, but does he have the capacity to do it? Of course. and similarly, God is completely omnipotent, and even though he conforms to certain rules of physics today, but that's only because just like there's a social convention, there's a physics convention, and that convention can change at any time, and that's the way the Mutakalimun view it. And without going into too much further detail, I just want to point out, but in C, he says this can only be posited if there's no such thing as intrinsic attributes. So that ultimately something can be a human being for one moment and then become an insect in the next. And the Rambam goes into, at that point, a sort of a very short, brief dialogue between a mutakalim and a philosopher, a kalamist and an Aristotelian philosopher. And basically, the philosopher believes that, as I mentioned before, there are intrinsic qualities and there are extrinsic qualities to any item that exists. The kalamist disagrees and says that there is no such thing as anything being intrinsic to any material substance, and that anything can change such that a human being can turn into a beetle in the next moment. Almost sounds Kafkaesque when you think about Kafka's story about the fellow who wakes up and discovers that he's a large bug, right? But it's maybe he got it from the Moreh Nevukhim and the Mutakalim one. I have no idea. But the point is that it's really quite bizarre that this idea of the Kalamists that anything can change and turn completely upside down at any given moment. Now, the Mutakalimun place a tremendous amount of stock in the imagination. And they basically say that just because perhaps intellectually something is not logical, because it doesn't conform to any kind of set rules, does not mean that it's unimaginable. And therefore, they posit that anything that is imaginable could potentially exist, even though it defies certain logical norms that we are used to seeing in our world. And here, I want to refer us back to, if you remember, this is going back a long time ago, and when we studied chapter 47, I gave you a snippet from a chapter in a book called The Texture of the Divine, Imagination in Medieval and Islamic and Jewish Thought. It's a book by Aaron Hughes, who's a professor. It's published by Indiana University Press. If you want to, it's a very, very interesting read, although it does tend to become somewhat technical at different points in the book. And at the beginning of chapter 3 just gives us a brief synopsis of the medieval view of the imagination faculty. And it's very important for us to remember that for medieval philosophy, there's different components of the mind. And the mind is comprised of an intellectual faculty and an imagination faculty. And those are two completely different components of the human consciousness. The intellect processes through logic, processes ideas. The imagination faculty conjures images and imagines things. And those are two very different things. Sometimes the imagination faculty conjures an image and then feeds that image to the intellectual faculty, which now uses that image to be able to come up with logical conclusions about what is and what is not. But the imagination faculty can also feed the intellect false images, and therefore one has to be very careful about certain ideas or things that one remembers, and make sure that when they sort of feed the image into that computer, the intellectual faculty, right, that it processes it properly, because sometimes what I may see is deceptive. I may see something that is an optical illusion. If I see a mirage in the desert, for example, and I give that to my intellectual faculty to process it, my intellectual faculty will conclude that that is a false image. Okay, and if I mistakenly allow my intellect to conclude that it's a real image, then I'm endangering myself by running towards it when indeed it's just a mirage. And so Hughes writes, he says, vision, the strongest of our senses, is central to our engagement with and in the world. Without vision, we encounter the world in only two dimensions, unable to process the fullness of the world in all of its richness and diversity. Since the currency of the imagination is images, its main activity is often associated with the type of visualization. This vision, however, is not external and directed toward what physically exists before us. Rather, it is internal, bringing into existence that which is no longer present, or that which may never have been present. For this reason, the medieval thinkers often refer to the imagination as the inner eye. The imagination is, thus, a creative faculty responsible for the formation of images of things or concepts that the senses have apprehended in the past, but that are no longer visible. And just to expand on that, the imagination can take 2 or 3 or 10 images that I've had in the past and put them all together. So that therefore I can imagine something that doesn't really exist. I might have seen wings on a bird, and I might have seen a lizard crawling on the ground. I can imagine the wings of the bird being appended to the back of the lizard so that I get a flying lizard. Does that flying lizard exist in reality, or any other kind of mythological beast? Does it really exist? No, of course not, but I've used my imagination faculty to conjure an image that is not real in the real world. The presencing of the absent is both the blessing and the curse of the imagination in the history of Western philosophy. Because of its ability to make the absent present, many philosophers in both the ancient and medieval worlds regarded this faculty as unreliable and unpredictable, responsible for the formation of inauthentic expressions. For example, the image of a beautiful object is not the same as the object itself, which in turn is but a pale imitation of a formal and incorporeal beauty. Now, he's using a Platonic kind of language here, and that when you think about it, and Aristotle subscribed to this idea in a sense as well. When I see a beautiful cubic piece of decor, and I admire it, or a beautiful piece of art, or a beautiful human being for that matter, I am admiring beauty that exists on a physical plane, but which really is not representative of the true reality of that beautiful item, because its true reality is its form, which exists on a non-corporeal plane. And it's only imbued within matter, which sort of captures that form in a rough or coarse way. So what I'm doing now is when I'm visualizing something, I see its physical representation, but that physical representation is only a representation of a different kind of non-physical form that I'm not really seeing. So therefore, even when I see something with my own eyes presently, I'm not seeing the thing in its totality. I'm only seeing the facade of that thing. Now, when I imagine something, right, images then are twice removed from the really real. For reasons such as this, philosophers distrusted the productive or mimetic aspect of the imagination. In a system that gives priority to intellection, to using the intellect to make conclusions about reality, production must always be derivative. The things that I produce, the images that I produce in my mind, are not really representative of reality. To imagine something then is secondary or even tertiary and inferior to our ability to encounter it physically and in such a manner that we can study, analyze, and truly know it. And if you want to read more about this, I recommend that you get Hughes's book on on Avicenna and on the Ibn Ezra, and about visions of heaven that many of the philosophers did discuss. The Ibn Ezra has a poem that he wrote that discusses these imaginative visions that he has of the heavens. And that has to be reconciled with a Maimonidean approach where imagining certain physical images that are representative of celestial beings is perhaps inappropriate in the Rambam's eyes. But the Rambam has a decidedly anti-imagination bias. He believes that the imagination is not the faculty that can truly represent for us reality. And he proves this point, and we're going to have to call it a day soon because we're running over time. He basically says that the intellect tells us that you can have are a planet Earth. And you can have a person standing on one side of the planet, let's say, on the Western Hemisphere, and another person standing on the Eastern Hemisphere. And the imagination tells you that one person has to be right side up and the other person has to be upside down. But our intellect proves to us that because of the laws of gravity and because of whatever other laws of physics exist, it is possible for both people to be right side up, even though in our imagination of two people standing on opposite sides of the planet, one person must be falling down and the other person must be upright, or one person must be standing up and the other person must be upside down. And there are other kinds of anomalies where the imagination tells us one thing. The imagination tells us that it's impossible for something to exist, where the intellect proves that it can and does exist. And there are other situations where the intellect proves that something cannot possibly exist, and yet the imagination still conjures images of that thing. And therefore, the Rambam says that although the mutakalimun invest a huge amount into the human imagination to conjure images, these images are not representative of reality. And they only, therefore, are of value to someone who doesn't believe in any rules of reality. And that's going to eventually lead to the 12th premise, which is basically to say that our senses are not good arbiters of any kind of reality. We can't determine any kind of reality according to the Mutakalimun using our senses or even using our intellect for that matter. But the point is that as we're seeing, the Rambam and the Mutakalimun are diverging further and further until they're almost not speaking the same language anymore. And so basically that's where we're going to hold it for today. The Rambam, quite interestingly, and Pines highlights this on page 209, where he puts in bold letters a call upon the reader's attention. It's almost like the Rambam is saying, hey, this is an important point. The Mutakalimun invest so much in the imagination faculty that they conjure up singular images of singular items that have nothing to do with the universal principles that the intellect deals with, and they use that to prove that anything that the mind can conjure in an image is a possibility. And he says, but the imagination is not a reliable faculty. The Rambam will return to this idea later on as well, throughout different discussions of where we diverge from the Mutakalimun. But this is the main point, that because God is omnipotent, God can do whatever he wants, and he gave us a mind to be able to imagine so many different possibilities of what can exist, and he did that because he wants us to imagine God's universe as being full of infinite numbers of possibilities. This is where we're going to hold it for today, and we're going to conclude chapter 73, God willing, next week, when we do premises 11 and 12, and maybe we'll elaborate a little bit further on this idea. So I wish you all a good day and a good week, and we'll see you next time.